and a professional storyteller. She tells us stories of inspiration and truth. I'm happy to know that she is also a past member of the TSA Board of Directors and a friend of mine. She is from Houston and is here tonight. Please welcome Kathy Culmer.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm awfully pleased to be here to share with you one of my favorite stories to tell, but there are some stories that I say I get to tell, and then there are some stories that tell me. And this is one of those that on occasion tells me. Now I have a part in here for you. You know by now that I'd like to have you join in. And it goes like this. When I give you this cue, I want you all to sing, God is greater than the King. Got it? Let's try it. God is greater than the King. God is greater than the King. Now once there was an evil king, and the king said to the people in his kingdom, from now on, you will worship me instead of God. And any of you who is found worshiping anyone other than me will get your heads chopped off. Now the people didn't like that, but there was nothing they could do, because you see, the king planted spies throughout the kingdom that watched the people day in and day out. And if they were found in any way paying homage to anything or anyone other than the king, then that spy would immediately go off to report it to the king. And he would do as he had said, order their heads chopped off. Now during this time, there was a woman named Opalunga who gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. And when the time came, Opalunga handed her son over to her husband, Osai, as was the custom among the people, to take him to the mountain and give him a name. Osai took the child in his strong arms, and he walked along, carrying the child. And as he walked along, he thought of how he wanted his son to know God. But how could he? Because of the king's decree. But as Osai walked along, an answer came to him. And when he reached the mountain, Osai took his son and lifted him up heavenwards and said, my son, I name you. God is greater than the king. God is greater than the king. Then Osai took the boy home and gave him to his mother, Opalunga, and said, Opalunga, I have named our son, God is greater than the king. And Opalunga said, what? Osai, have you lost your mind? For surely when the king learns what we've named our son, he's going to order our heads chopped off. Osai said, I did what had to be done. The rest is in God's hands. Well, Opalunga received no comfort from that, and she began to cry, and she cried and cried for days, and then finally, she went to her husband and said, Osai, I couldn't imagine our son being killed, so I think that we should give him another name. Let's call him another name when others are around. And when we are here alone, we'll call him that name you gave him. God is greater than the king. And Osiah agreed. So the boy grew up hearing himself called by these two names, and when he was old enough, they gave him the answer. They explained to him why that was so. And the boy was fine. But then one day, Opalunga was tired. She'd had a rough day. The boy was still outside playing with friends when she finished dinner. So without thinking at all, she opened up the door and called, God is greater than, God is greater than the king. Dinner's ready. Oops. But it was too late. And the spy that was planted outside of the house went immediately to the king and reported, King, I heard a woman call her child, God is greater than the king. Do you want me to bring them so you can, chop off their heads? But the king said, no, I will handle this differently. You go and you have the husband come to me. And with that, his spy went off to Osiah's house, and he announced to Osiah and his wife, Osiah, the king wants to see you right away. And Opalunga began to fret, oh no, Osiah, this is just because you... Osiah said, whatever happens, it's in God's hands. I'm not afraid, Opalunga. And he followed the king's spy, who led him to the king, of course, but to his surprise, to his delight, to his amazement, the king did not order his head chopped off. Instead, the king said, Osiah, I hear you are a wise man, and I want you to come and work for me and be my counselor. And then the king took out a ring. And he said to Osiah, and Osiah, as a token of my trust in you, as a token of my friendship, I want you to wear this ring. And whenever anyone sees it, then they will know that they have to obey you as they do me. Well, as you can imagine, Osiah was relieved and he hurried off. And he said to Opalunga, the king didn't want to kill us after all. Maybe things are not as they seem, Opalunga. And look, he has given me this ring as a token of his trust for me. But Opalunga wasn't buying it. Opalunga said, Osiah, I wouldn't believe the king. That king is an evil man. Why, he will send his spies to steal that ring, and then he'll blame you for having lost it. No, Osiah, I think we should find a hiding place for that ring. I think you should hide that ring in a hole in the ground beneath your sleeping mat. And only wear it on feast days when friends are around, and not while you're working. Osiah agreed with his wife, took her advice, dug a hole beneath the sleeping mat, and that is where he hid the ring. But then the time came when Osiah had to leave his town for several days. And as he was leaving, that spy that was there day in and day out watching saw that Osiah was not wearing the ring. And immediately he went off to report it to the king. He said, King, I saw Osiah leaving. He wasn't wearing your ring, King. And the king said, ha! Time has come for my revenge. You have the wife. You have Opalunga come and see me. And off he went to fetch Opalunga. And he announced to her, Opalunga, the king wants to see you right away. She was terrified. But she went with him. She had no choice. But once again, the king welcomed her. The king did not order any execution. Instead, the king said, Opalunga, I gave your husband a ring. And I want you to bring me that ring so that I can have a duplicate of it made, so that I will have a ring identical to his. And again, people will know of the great bond between us. Opalanga was so relieved. She went as quickly as she could, took up the sleeping mat, dug in the ground, took out that ring, and went quickly to take it to the king. The king received the ring graciously and dismissed her. But as soon as Opalanga was gone, he gave that ring to one of his servants and ordered him to throw it into the ocean. And then he ordered them to arrest Osai when he returned to his town. And the next day, as Osai was entering the city gate, he was apprehended by the servants of the king, who took him immediately before the king. The king looked at Osai and said, "Osai, I see you are not wearing that ring I gave you. Do you think so little of my gift that you don't wear it? Or have you lost it? Or maybe have even sold it?" Osai assured the king that none of these was true, that he knew exactly where the ring was, that the ring was at his home. And the king said to him, "If that is so, Osai, you bring me the ring. Bring it to me. In fact, Osai, I will give you 3 days to bring me the ring. And if you bring me the ring, I will give you my kingdom. But if you do not, I will have all of your heads." Well, Osai was sure of where he had left the ring, so he wasn't worried, and he went home, and as he was taking up the sleeping mat, Opalanga returned. And she asked her husband, "Osai, what are you doing?" And Osai said, I'm looking for the king's ring. The king has asked me to bring the ring in." And Opalanga said, "But Osai, while you were away, the king had me bring him that ring. The king said he wanted to have a duplicate so you both have the same ring." Osai said to his wife, "But Opalanga, the king has given me 3 days to bring the ring to him. And if I do not, he has vowed to kill us all." Opalanga began to cry, but this time her husband had no words of comfort for her, and her crying grew louder and louder. She was wailing so until finally the neighbors came to see what was the matter. And Opalanga began to tell the story. Tell of how Osai had named their son.
God is greater than the king.
Always throw that in there, see if y'all still wait. God is greater than the king. And while she was explaining this to the neighbors, the boy came in. And when she was all done with her explanation, the boy said, but mother, isn't God greater than the king?" And when the boy asked that question, Osai lifted his son into his arms and he answered, "Yes, my son, God is greater than the king. And we will celebrate the greatness of God." And then Osai had his neighbors go home to fetch their drums. And Opalanga went to the market, and Osai began to build a fire on which to cook the food for the great feast celebration that they would have. The neighbors came and began to set up the drums. Opalanga returned from the market where she bought bread and fruit and fish and vegetables. And Osai continued to build the fire. Until all of a sudden, Opalanga cried out, "Osai, come, neighbors! they all ran and gathered around Opalunga as she stood there over the belly of an open fish. And there inside of the belly was the king's ring. Osai was so excited, he grabbed the ring and put it on his finger and began to dance around and say, "It's a miracle, wonderful thing. Let us rejoice, give thanks and sing. God is greater than the king." And the neighbors began to play their drums and they sang, "We will play our drums and sing. God is greater than the king." And they were celebrating, they were dancing and singing and drumming, everyone, except that spy that was out there watching the whole thing. He didn't get it. These folk were about to be taken out, and they were celebrating. He went quickly to tell the king, "King, I heard Osai and his family and his neighbors all singing and dancing. God is greater than the king." The king was outraged, and he called for his warriors and his weapons. He said he vowed to kill them all. And they charged over to the house. And when they arrived at Osai's house, the dancing stopped, the singing, the drumming, and all was quiet. And the king with clenched fists said, you fools, don't you know there is no God? There is no God." And Osai walked over to the king, held out his hand and said, "Oh, no, king, but you are wrong. For who else on this day could deliver into my hand both this ring and your kingdom?" For it was by the king's own decree that if Osai should return the ring, he should have his kingdom. And so it was. Osai became the king. And in time, people were again allowed to worship as they saw fit. And they continue to believe, it's a miracle, a wonderful thing. Let us rejoice, give thanks, and sing. God is great.